Have you ever wondered what goes on in the mind of the world's most evil prisoners? What kind of world do they think they're living in? Well, for some, it's all about control, having power over someone else's life. Others believe they're on a dark mission, driven by their horrifying beliefs, and many of them live without empathy, unable to distinguish right from wrong. But whatever their mindset, it's truly horrifying to step into their world and try to understand their minds. From Charles Manson, who manipulated a cult into committing gruesome murders, to Luis Garavito, who confessed to murdering over 190 children. Here are the 20 most dangerous prisoners of all time. Charles Manson. Let's start with Charles Manson, one of America's most infamous convicted murderers. But first, here's the twist. He never killed anyone himself. Instead, Manson led a cult known as the Manson family, convincing his followers to carry out brutal murders on his behalf. In 1971, Manson and several of his followers were convicted for the Tate LaBianca killings, a horrific crime spree that left 7 people dead, including actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. Well, originally sentenced to death, Manson's punishment was reduced to life in prison when California abolished the death penalty. He spent the rest of his days behind bars, still notorious, until his death in 2017 at the age of 83. The terrifying impact he had over others makes his story one of the most disturbing to this day. But he's not the only one with such evil tendencies. Another name that stands out is Richard Ramirez, whose crimes were just as terrifying. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, a drifter from Texas, ended up in Los Angeles in the early 1980s, a city already haunted by serial killers operating independently. But what was the thing that brought him to this city? Its history of murderers, or was it fate? Ramirez, who worked odd jobs like being a car mechanic, had a strange obsession with Satanism. Well, his killing spree started in June 1984 when he began breaking into victims' homes late at night, often through unlocked windows. Armed with a gun or other weapons, he would threaten his victims in their beds before brutally killing them, and if that was not enough, he also mutilated their bodies. How could someone commit such heinous acts? Well, his victims ranged from an 84-year-old to a 6-year-old child. The terror continued until March 1985, when one victim survived and provided police with a crucial description of the killer. And this was the break they had been waiting for. As police gathered clues, they focused on a man who matched the description. Tall, Hispanic, with curly hair, bulging eyes, and wide-spaced, rotting teeth. And finally, in August 1985, a fingerprint led the police to Ramirez, and he was captured after a crowd in East Los Angeles chased him down. By 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders and 22 assaults, and he was sentenced to death. Though he awaited execution, Ramirez ultimately died of natural causes on death row in 2013. Ted Bundy. Next up, the name that needs no introduction, Ted Bundy. Arguably one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, Bundy confessed to killing 36 women, though authorities believe the true count may be even higher. His attacks started in 1974, focusing on young women who were usually dark-haired with their hair parted in the middle. I mean, seriously, what was his obsession with these women? Well, Bundy was known for his charm and clever schemes, sometimes pretending to be injured or needing help, only to lure his victims to secluded areas and commit his horrific crimes. After a series of disappearances, Bundy was eventually arrested for burglary in 1975, and evidence began linking him to multiple murders. But Bundy was as clever as he was dangerous. He escaped from custody twice. His second escape led him to Florida, where he carried out one of his most brutal attacks, breaking into a home and attacking 4 women, killing 2. And finally, the day came. In 1978, when Bundy's rampage came to an end after he was captured and later convicted of multiple murders, including his last known victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He was sentenced to death and, in 1989, was executed in the electric chair. This wasn't it. After Bundy's horrific crimes, Eileen Wuornos made headlines as one of America's most notorious female serial killers. Eileen Wuornos. Well, Eileen wasn't the first woman to kill, but she was one of the few who used a gun as her weapon. Her case raised many questions about gender, violence, and even self-defense. Well, Warnes had a rough childhood, growing up in foster care and turning to prostitution as a teenager to survive. But how did this lead to her killing spree? In 1989 to 1990, while posing as a hitchhiking prostitute, she killed 7 men along highways in Florida and southern Georgia. Yeah, you heard that right, 7 men. But the interesting thing is that she initially claimed she acted in self-defense after being assaulted. But what was the truth? Because just after her arrest in 1991, Warnes confessed she killed for profit, not self-defense. And in 1992, she was convicted of 1 murder and later admitted to 3 more. In the end, Warnes was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in 2002. Pedro Alonso Lopez. Next in line is Pedro Alonso Lopez, a serial killer whose troubled childhood was filled with homelessness, violence, and abuse. While psychologists say that these early experiences shaped his behavior. In 1980, he was caught in Ambato, where he shocked authorities by admitting to 110 murders. He also targeted young girls across several countries. How could someone commit such a number of killings and still be free for so long? Well, despite the scale of his crimes, Lopez served only 14 years in prison before being set free. In 1994, he was deported to Colombia, where he was arrested again for another murder. But then, something strange happened. He was declared insane. The question arises, what made the authorities believe this? Well, in 1998, he was released again, but this time, he was declared sane. How could this happen, and where is he now? He has been at large ever since, leaving many wondering if he'll strike again, or already has. After Lopez's disappearance, Thomas Silverstein's violent acts within the prison system highlighted the dangers even behind bars. Thomas Silverstein. Thomas Silverstein, also known as Terrible Tom, was one of the most dangerous prisoners ever. A leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, he became infamous for his violent actions behind bars. But what made him so deadly? He was convicted of 3 murders, including the brutal killing of a correction officer, Merle Klutz, in 1983. And it didn't stop there. He was also linked to 2 other killings of correction officers. His actions led to stricter prison rules, but even in solitary confinement, he kept a terrifying reputation. Well, how did he manage to keep causing chaos while locked away? Silverstein spent 36 years in solitary until he died in 2019, leaving behind a legacy of fear and violence. Linking to Silverstein, another name that comes to mind is Albert DeSalvo, known as the Boston Strangler. He terrified the streets with a series of brutal murders. Albert Henry DeSalvo. Well, just like Pedro, Albert also grew up in a violent home. Between June 14, 1962 and January 4, 1964, he brutally raped and murdered 13 women, satisfying his uncontrollable urges. Before his killing spree, DeSalvo had avoided a sexual assault charge involving a minor. He worked as a door-to-door modeling agent, earning the nickname the Measuring Man. But his true horrors were yet to come. He became known as the Green Man, terrorizing women by raping them while they were tied to their beds. Then, after his release from prison, the murders began, with signature, decorative bows tied around the victims' necks. Well, after Albert, there comes another dangerous prisoner, Robert Maudsley, who shocked the world with his violent prison killings. Robert Maudsley. Robert Maudsley, known as Hannibal the Cannibal, was charged with 3 murders and 1 manslaughter between 1974 and 1978. All his victims were either criminals or already in prison. But before going any further, just imagine, because of your horrific presence, you're thrown into jail only to be placed in solitary confinement because you're still seen as a danger, even behind bars. That's exactly what happened to Maudsley. In 1983, authorities decided that his violent tendencies were too dangerous for the general prison population, so he was isolated from everyone else. Despite trying to appeal for freedom in 2000, his request was denied, and he remains in solitary confinement to this day. How terrifying is that? Even in prison, Maudsley remains a threat to everyone around him. After Maudsley's horrifying crimes, David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam, brought fear to New York City with his deadly rampage. David Berkowitz, Son of Sam. David Berkowitz's crime spree began in 1975 when he stabbed 2 women in New York, but that was just the start. Between 1975 and 1977, Berkowitz killed 6 people and wounded 11 others. Can you imagine the terror he caused in New York City? For years, he evaded the police, slipping through their fingers after each attack, but it wasn't until 1977 that the police finally caught him. Berkowitz pleaded guilty to the murders and was sentenced to 6 life sentences in prison. Well, if you think David was the worst of all, wait until you hear about Donald Gaskins, who took his dark persona to another level. Donald Gaskins. Pee Wee Gaskins, born Donald Gaskins in 1933, confessed to killing at least 15 people, but some believe the true number was much higher. His victims ranged from strangers to people he knew personally, and many were buried near his home in South Carolina. Gaskins used shocking methods to kill, like strangling, drowning, and even using acid to destroy bodies. Well, one of his most heinous acts was when he planned the murder of another inmate on death row in 1982. Imagine the fear and chaos inside that prison. Gaskins was executed in 1991, but even as he faced his own death, he showed no remorse for the lives he took. While Gaskins shocked the world with his brutal murders and cold behavior, another killer, John Wayne Gacy, was committing his own horrors in Illinois. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, born in 1942 in Chicago, was known as a friendly, well-liked member of the community. He even dressed up as Pogo the Clown for children's parties. But behind that mask was a dark secret. Gacy had been arrested multiple times for sexual misconduct, and after serving time in prison, he began a horrifying killing spree. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He lured his victims to his home with promises of work or money, then trapped them with handcuffs before subjecting them to unspeakable horrors. His capture came in December 1975 after he kidnapped 15-year-old Robert Piest, leading police to uncover the bodies of his victims. How could such a monster hide in plain sight for so long? Well, Gacy was executed by lethal injection in 1994, but his terrifying legacy still haunts us today. Carl Panzram. Next in line is Carl Panzram, born in 1891. He was an American serial killer known for his extreme violence and lack of remorse. Throughout his life, he used many false names and served time in prisons across the country, where he frequently attacked guards and endured harsh punishments. Panzram claimed to have killed 21 people and committed countless other violent acts, openly admitting that he felt no guilt. Imagine being one of his victims. The fear and pain they went through is hard to even think about. Finally, on December 5th, 1930, he was hanged at Leavenworth Prison, leaving behind his writings that later became the book Killer, A Journal of Murder, published in 1970. Edmund Kemper. Just like Carl, another prisoner that comes to mind is Edmund Kemper, also known as the Co-Ed Killer. He committed his first murders at just 15, killing his grandparents, and you'll be shocked to hear the reason behind it. He killed them just to see what it felt like. Yeah, you heard that right. But that was only the beginning. In the early 1970s, Kemper went on to murder several young women, often picking up hitchhikers around Santa Cruz, California. His crimes were brutal. He didn't just kill them, he mutilated their bodies. His killing spree finally ended with his own mother and her friend, whom he murdered before calling the police to confess. In October 1973, Kemper was tried for 8 counts of first-degree murder and found guilty in November. He's now serving his time at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. Well, if you think he was the worst of all, wait until you see the next dangerous prisoner, Henry Lee Lucas. Henry Lee Lucas had a rough start in life, born into a brutal and broken home in Blacksburg, Virginia. As an adult, he led a wandering life, traveling across the South, allegedly killing hitchhikers and others he crossed paths with. In 1976, he met Otis Toole in Florida, and the two became both lovers and partners in crime. But things took a darker turn when Lucas took Toole's young niece, Becky, as a common-law wife in 1982. After a heated argument, Lucas killed her in Texas. Once arrested, he shocked the world by confessing to hundreds of murders. But here's the twist. His death sentence was eventually commuted by Texas Governor George W. Bush as doubts began to rise about the truth of his confessions. Was he really guilty of all those crimes, or was he just trying to make a name for himself? In the end, he died in prison, but the mystery of his confessions still lingers. Well, if you think Henry Lee Lucas's story was shocking, wait until you hear about Rodney Alcala, a man whose charm hid a much darker side. Rodney Alcala. Born in 1943 in San Antonio, Texas, Rodney Alcala was a convicted sex offender and serial killer. He was convicted of 5 murders, but is believed to have killed many more. Well, he was charged with the rape and attempted murder of a 13-year-old girl. He spent years on the run before being arrested and eventually awaiting execution at San Quentin State Prison, where he ultimately died. Gary Ridgway, Green River Killer. Just like Rodney, there's another name that strikes fear. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Born in Utah and later moving to Washington, Ridgway worked as a truck painter, but between 1982 and 2001, he became infamous for killing women, mostly prostitutes, along a stretch of road in Seattle. His victims, aged 15 to 31, were strangled after being assaulted. In 2001, Ridgway was finally arrested, but what followed was even more disturbing. He confessed to killing 48 women. But did he really stop there? Some believe his victims could number much higher. In 2003, he avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dennis Rader, BTK Killer. Next in line is Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK Killer. In his own evil mind, he lived 2 lives, one as a family man, husband, and Boy Scout leader, and the other as a cold-blooded predator. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader brutally killed 10 people, including 4 members of one family and 6 women. Much like the son of Sam, Rader taunted the police and media with letters and poems sending disturbing messages. In one of his letters, he boldly asked, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" His taunts continued for years until his capture in 2005. Rader is now serving 10 consecutive life sentences in prison. He remains in solitary confinement, where he will spend the rest of his life locked away from the world that once feared him. Jack Unterweger. Then comes another brutal prisoner, Jack Unterweger. Born in 1950 in Austria, was a serial killer who used his intelligence to become a celebrated writer. In 1976, an 18-year-old woman became his first victim, after which he was sentenced to life in prison. Later in jail, he gained fame with his autobiography, Fegefeuer, convincing many he had reformed. In 1990, he was paroled and people started to see him as a heroic literary figure. But instead of changing, Unterweger resumed killing. After his release, he went on to kill at least 9 more women. He used to kill women by strangling them with bra straps and leaving their bodies in shocking positions. Finally, after arrest and conviction in 1994, Unterweger took his own life in his cell. Well, if you think Unterweger was the most evil one, the next prisoner, Andre Chikatilo, committed crimes that would blow your mind. Andre Chikatilo, one of the world's most horrifying serial killers, was born on August 16, 1936 in Ukraine. Growing up shy and haunted by dark family stories, he struggled with personal issues and often felt isolated. But in 1978, Chikatilo's violent impulses took over, and he ended up claiming at least 52 lives. Interestingly, most of his victims were young and vulnerable. After years of denial from authorities, he was caught in 1990 and confessed to his crimes. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1994. Last but not least is Luis Garavito, whose gruesome murders left people terrified. Luis Garavito. Known as the Beast, he was a Colombian serial killer who confessed to murdering over 190 children in the 1990s. Using multiple techniques, he kidnapped, abused, and killed minors, mostly from low-income families. His usual method of killing was by at least one cut in the lateral part of the neck or by decapitation. Later in 1999, after his arrest on a rape charge, Garavito admitted to his crimes and expressed remorse. He died in 2023 at the age of 66 while imprisoned in Valledupar, Colombia. And that wraps up our list of the 20 most dangerous prisoners. Thanks for watching. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel.